Before the first American soldier set foot on a European battlefield in significant numbers, German military intelligence had already built a detailed picture of what he would be. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had been studying the United States Army since the late 1930s. Their analysts had access to American military publications, training manuals, newspaper accounts, and the reports of military attachés who had observed American forces in peacetime. They had constructed psychological profiles, tactical assessments, and cultural analyses that their senior officers used to predict how American units would behave in combat. The picture those files painted was consistent. Americans were individualistic to the point of insubordination. Their peacetime military was small, underfunded, and institutionally immature compared to the European powers. Their soldiers came from a civilian culture that valued personal comfort, personal freedom, and the absence of the kind of collective discipline that professional European armies had spent generations instilling. They would fight, perhaps when cornered, but they would not absorb sustained casualties. They would not maintain cohesion under prolonged pressure. They would not, ultimately, stomach the kind of total war that the German military machine had been built to wage. This assessment was not constructed from nothing. It had a logic to it. The United States had not fought a major land war since the First World War, and even then, American forces had arrived late and had operated under significant French and British guidance. The interwar American military had been deliberately kept small by a political culture that was deeply suspicious of standing armies and deeply committed to staying out of European conflicts. The German files were not entirely wrong about what America had been. They were catastrophically wrong about what America was becoming. The first thing German officers encountered that their files had not predicted was simple, fundamental, and deeply unsettling. American soldiers, under fire, did not break the way the models said they would. In the opening engagements of the North African campaign, at Casserine Pass in February of 1943, where German armor under Rommel inflicted a sharp and painful defeat on American forces, the initial German assessment seemed to be confirmed. American units had performed poorly, communications had broken down, and some formations had retreated in disorder. German officers noted this with professional satisfaction. The files appeared to be accurate. What happened next was not in the files. American units that had been beaten at Casserine did not dissolve. They did not generate mass surrenders. They did not produce the organizational collapse that the German model of American psychology predicted. They reorganized. They replaced their commanders. They went back into the line. And within weeks, they were fighting with a tenacity and a tactical competence that bore almost no resemblance to the force that had stumbled at Casserine. German officers who observed this process described it with a word that appeared repeatedly in their after-action analyses, a word that carried, in the German professional military vocabulary, a specific and serious meaning: resilience. Not courage in the individual, theatrical sense. Institutional resilience, the capacity of an organization, after a significant defeat, to absorb the shock, identify what had gone wrong, fix it, and return to the fight without losing its fundamental cohesion and will. The German military tradition produced fighters of extraordinary individual quality. It produced units of ferocious tactical capability. What it had not produced, and what the Casserine experience revealed the Americans possessed in unexpected abundance, was an institutional culture that treated defeat not as a verdict, but as information. The Americans lost at Casserine. They learned from it faster than the Germans had thought possible, and the force that returned to the North African battlefield 3 weeks later was measurably better than the force that had been beaten. The files had no category for this. The second quality that German officers encountered and struggled to account for was the American soldier's instinctive, almost reflexive habit of solving problems that were, strictly speaking, above his pay grade. German military structure was built on a clear, explicit hierarchy of decision-making authority. Problems at each level of command were addressed by the officer responsible for that level. A private solved the problems of a private. A sergeant solved the problems of a sergeant. A lieutenant solved the problems of a lieutenant. The system was logical, efficient when operating as designed, and produced a military force in which each element knew its function and performed it with extraordinary precision. It also meant that when the structure was disrupted, when officers were killed, when communications were severed, when the carefully planned sequence of events stopped corresponding to the actual events, the system had significant difficulty improvising below the level at which decision-making authority formally resided. American soldiers improvised constantly. Not because they were insubordinate, though German officers sometimes interpreted it that way, which was itself a revealing misreading, but because American civilian culture in the 1930s and 1940s produced men who had grown up understanding, at a bone-deep level, that problems got fixed by whoever was standing next to them. A farm kid from Iowa who had spent his adolescence keeping aging equipment running with spare wire and improvised solutions did not wait for an authority figure to tell him the Jeep engine was broken. He fixed the Jeep. A factory worker from Cleveland who had spent years on an assembly line where a breakdown in one station stopped the entire line did not stand and watch the line stop. He found the problem and cleared it. German officers in France reported, with a mixture of professional admiration and genuine bafflement, American enlisted men making decisions in the field that German officers of equivalent rank would have required explicit authorization to make. American corporals rerouting supply convoys around destroyed bridges without waiting for orders. American sergeants establishing defensive positions in tactically sound locations that no officer had designated. American privates finding themselves separated from their units in the chaos of the Normandy breakout, attaching themselves to the nearest American force they could find and immediately making themselves useful. The German professional model had a name for a soldier who acted outside his assigned authority. It was not a compliment. The American Army had a different name for it. It called it initiative, and it trained for it, rewarded it, and built its entire tactical doctrine around the assumption that the men at every level of the chain of command were capable of exercising it. The third quality that unsettled German officers was harder to categorize professionally, and some of them were reluctant to include it in formal analyses because it seemed almost too subjective to be militarily relevant. American soldiers, in conditions of sustained hardship and danger, maintained a psychological disposition that German observers described with a cluster of related terms: humor, irreverence, a refusal to treat their own suffering with the gravity that the situation, by any objective measure, warranted. German military culture was serious, appropriately so, given what it was asking its soldiers to do. The Wehrmacht tradition had a solemnity to it, a weight, a formality, a sense that the business of war was a sacred and demanding calling that deserved to be treated as such. German soldiers were trained to bear hardship with stoic dignity. Complaining, in the Wehrmacht tradition, was not merely frowned upon. It was incompatible with the professional identity of the German soldier. American soldiers complained constantly. They complained about the food, the weather, the mud, the officers, the equipment, the length of the war, the specific and creative injustice of their particular assignment within the war. They complained with an inventiveness and a profanity that would have resulted in disciplinary action in almost any European army. And then they did the job anyway. German prisoners who were held in American-run camps described, in their post-war accounts, a specific confusion about the relationship between American soldiers' complaints and their actual behavior. The complaints, in German military culture, would have been indicators of low morale, of soldiers who were approaching the psychological limit of their endurance. But American soldiers who complained the most loudly about their conditions were frequently the same soldiers who performed most aggressively in combat. The complaints were not a sign of breaking. They were a social mechanism, a pressure valve that allowed soldiers to acknowledge, collectively and with humor, the genuine awfulness of their situation, without allowing that acknowledgement to become despair. German officers who understood this distinction found it, professionally speaking, extremely concerning, because it meant that the traditional indicators they used to assess enemy morale, the signs that a unit was approaching its breaking point, did not apply to Americans the way they applied to every other army the Wehrmacht had faced. You could not read American soldiers by the standard instruments. The fourth quality was perhaps the most philosophically disorienting for German officers to process, because it struck at the foundation of how they understood the motivational architecture of a military force. German soldiers in the Second World War fought, in the assessment of their own leadership and of most post-war historians, for a complex mixture of motivations: national pride, unit loyalty, ideological conviction of varying intensity, and the specific social bonds between men who had trained together, fought together, and depended on each other for survival. The Wehrmacht's cohesion at the unit level was genuine and remarkable, and it was sustained in significant part by a shared identity: German soldiers fighting as Germans, within a tradition, within a culture, within an ideological framework that gave their sacrifice a collective meaning. American soldiers fought for their squad, not for a cause, at least not primarily, not for a political philosophy, though most of them would have been able to articulate one if pressed, not for abstract patriotism, though that existed at the margins. They fought, in the immediate and visceral sense, for the specific men next to them: the man on the left, the man on the right, the men in the foxhole they had been sharing for the past 3 weeks. This was not unique to Americans. Combat soldiers throughout history have described the same reduction of motivation under fire, from the abstract to the intensely personal, but the specific quality of American unit cohesion had a characteristic that German officers noted and found structurally significant. It was remarkably resistant to the manipulation of its external conditions. German tactical doctrine, particularly in the defensive operations of 1944 and 1945, included deliberate efforts to disrupt enemy morale by exploiting the gap between what soldiers had been promised and what they were actually experiencing. Propaganda leaflets, broadcasts, psychological operations designed to highlight the distance between the official narrative of the war and the reality of the muddy, frozen, lethal trench the soldier was actually occupying. These operations worked to measurable degrees against some Allied forces. Against American units, they consistently underperformed expectations. German intelligence officers analyzing the results of their psychological operations against Americans reported a pattern that frustrated them professionally. American soldiers appeared to have a fundamentally low investment in the official narrative to begin with. They had not been promised a beautiful war. They had not been given an ideological framework that required the reality to match the promise. They knew, with the unsentimental clarity of young men who had been shipped across an ocean to a place they hadn't asked to go, that the war was cold and muddy and lethal and unglamorous. They already knew that. They just hadn't quit yet. You cannot disillusion a man who was never illusioned. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied intelligence teams systematically debriefed captured German officers across every branch and rank of the Wehrmacht. The American soldier appeared, in one form or another, in nearly every session. The picture that assembled itself across those interrogations was not the picture of the enemy those officers had expected to face. They had expected undisciplined individuals who would perform erratically without strong officer leadership, and instead encountered a force whose individual initiative was itself a form of discipline, directed and purposeful, rather than chaotic. They had expected soldiers whose civilian comfort culture would make them brittle under sustained hardship, and instead encountered men who were genuinely uncomfortable and who kept fighting anyway, sustained by a social cohesion that operated at the squad level and was virtually impervious to disruption from outside. They had expected an army that would fight well when winning and collapse when losing, and instead encountered a force that treated military reversal as a technical problem to be solved, rather than a psychological blow to be absorbed. One German general, a corps commander who had fought against American forces from Normandy to the Rhine, put the core of it in a single observation that Allied intelligence officers found clear enough to quote directly in their reports. He said that his professional education had prepared him to fight armies that were built on the same assumptions about human nature that the German military used to build its own force, that soldiers were motivated by ideology, by fear of authority, by collective identity, and by the weight of tradition. American soldiers, he said, appeared to be motivated by something his model had no precise category for. He called it, after thinking about it for a moment, a kind of angry practicality. They were not fighting because they believed in something abstract. They were fighting because there was a job in front of them and they intended to finish it, and anyone who got between them and finishing it was going to have a very bad day. He said he had spent the better part of a year trying to find the lever that would break that motivation. He never found it. The German intelligence failure on the American soldier was not primarily a failure of information gathering. The files were reasonably accurate about what American civilian culture looked like from the outside. The individualism was real. The relative lack of military tradition was real. The distance between American peacetime society and the kind of total military mobilization the war would require was real. The failure was a failure of imagination, a failure to consider what happened when all of those qualities were put under pressure, organized into a military structure, and aimed at a specific and concrete problem. The individualism that German analysts read as indiscipline became, under fire, initiative, the capacity to solve the immediate problem in front of you without waiting for permission. The comfort-seeking that German analysts read as softness became, under hardship, a very specific kind of stubbornness. The refusal of men who knew exactly how bad their situation was to pretend it was acceptable, combined with the refusal to let the badness of the situation stop them from doing the job. The absence of deep military tradition that German analysts read as institutional immaturity became, in practice, a freedom from the kind of doctrinal rigidity that caused the German military to keep fighting its preferred war long after the conditions of the actual war had made that preference lethal. German officers had looked at American civilian culture and seen weakness. What was actually there was a set of raw materials, practical, stubborn, adaptable, deeply and personally loyal at the small group level, that turned out to be almost perfectly suited to the specific demands of industrial total war. The files never saw it coming. The battlefields of France and Germany provided the correction, and by the time the German military fully understood what it was actually facing, there was nothing left with which to adapt.